The notary's pen hovered over the documents spread across my dining room table, the same table where my late husband Harold and I had shared 37 years of meals, conversations, and dreams. Sandra, my daughter-in-law, stood beside him with that practiced smile she'd perfected over the years, the one that never quite reached her eyes. Michael, my son, shifted nervously in the corner, avoiding my gaze like he had when he was 7 and broke my grandmother's vase. "Everything's ready. We sold the house," Sandra announced, her voice carrying that tone of false sweetness she reserved for moments when she thought she was winning. "You're going to the street." I looked at her, really looked at her, taking in the designer purse clutched in her manicured hands, the expensive jewelry that seemed to multiply every month, the confidence of someone who believed they'd outsmarted a grieving widow.
Before we continue, comment where you're watching from and subscribe to the channel. We'd love to see how far our stories are reaching.
The notary cleared his throat uncomfortably, clearly sensing the tension in the room but unsure of its source. "Great," I said calmly, setting down my coffee cup with deliberate precision. "But before I leave, how about we take a quick ride to court? They've had your signatures under review for weeks." The color drained from Sandra's face so quickly I thought she might faint. The notary looked confused, his pen still suspended in midair. Michael's head snapped up, his eyes wide with something that looked like panic mixed with dawning realization. "What are you talking about?" Sandra stammered, her voice losing its practiced smoothness. "What signatures?" I reached into the drawer of my antique secretary desk, the one Harold had restored for our 20th anniversary, and pulled out a manila folder I'd been keeping there for the past month. My hands were steady, though my heart was pounding with the adrenaline of finally confronting the people who'd tried to steal everything Harold and I had built together. "I'm talking about the signatures on Harold's will," I said, opening the folder and spreading several documents on the table. The ones that were mysteriously different from every other document Harold signed in 40 years of marriage. The notary set his pen down entirely now, leaning forward to examine the papers I'd laid out. I could see his professional interest peaked as he compared the documents side by side. Sandra took a step backward, bumping into the china cabinet where my wedding dishes were displayed. "That's ridiculous," Michael finally spoke, but his voice cracked like it used to when he lied about breaking curfew in high school. "Dad's will is perfectly legitimate. It's been probated." I smiled at my son, the same patient smile I'd given him countless times when he was growing up and trying to talk his way out of trouble. "You're right, Michael. A will was probated, but it wasn't your father's will." The silence that followed was deafening. The grandfather clock in the hallway continued its steady tick, marking time while 3 lives hung in the balance. The notary was now studying the documents with the focused attention of someone who recognized potential fraud when he saw it. "Mrs. Patterson," he said slowly, "these signature samples show some concerning inconsistencies. The will that was filed shows signatures that appear to deviate significantly from Mr. Patterson's established hand." Sandra's breathing had become shallow and rapid. "You can't prove anything," she whispered, but her voice lacked conviction. I walked to the window that overlooked the garden Harold and I had planted together, where his roses still bloomed every spring. The irony wasn't lost on me that Sandra was trying to sell the house in the same room where Harold had actually written his real will, the one I'd found hidden in his woodworking shop just 3 weeks ago. "Actually, I can prove quite a lot," I said, turning back to face them. "You see, after Harold died, I kept having this nagging feeling that something wasn't right. He'd always been so particular about his handwriting, so precise. The signatures on that will you filed just didn't look like him." Michael was now pacing, running his hands through his hair the way he'd done since childhood when he was stressed. "Mom, you're grieving. Sometimes grief can make us see things that aren't there." "Oh, but they are there, sweetheart." I pulled out another document from the folder. "This is the real will, written in Harold's actual handwriting, witnessed by our neighbors Bob and Eleanor Martinez, and dated just 3 months before he died. Would you like to know what it says?" Sandra lunged forward as if to grab the document, but the notary was quicker, his professional instincts taking over. "Ma'am, I need to examine these documents before anyone touches them further." "By all means," I said, handing him the papers. "I think you'll find them very interesting." As the notary studied Harold's genuine will, I watched Sandra and Michael's faces transform. The arrogance melted away, replaced by fear and desperation. I thought about all the months since Harold's death when they'd treated me like a burden, making decisions about my care without consulting me, gradually taking control of my finances and my life. This will, the notary said carefully, appears to leave the entire estate to Mrs. Patterson, with specific provisions that any previous wills are null and void. It also includes language suggesting the testator was concerned about potential interference with his wishes. I nodded. Harold suspected something was wrong in the last months of his life. He told me Sandra had been asking too many questions about his finances, about what would happen to the house when he was gone. That's why he wrote this new will and hid it where only I would find it. Michael collapsed into Harold's old recliner, his face in his hands. "Sandra," he said, his voice muffled, "tell me you didn't do what I think you did." But Sandra was already moving toward the door, her composure completely shattered. "This is insane," she said, her voice rising to near hysteria. "You can't prove that will is real. Harold was sick, probably confused. The will we filed is the legitimate one. Then you won't mind explaining to the handwriting experts how Harold's signature changed so dramatically in the space of 3 weeks," I said. "Or how 2 witnesses who were supposedly present for the signing were actually out of state on the dates listed." The notary was now making notes, his expression serious. "Mrs. Patterson, I have to advise you that if these allegations are accurate, we're looking at potential criminal fraud. I cannot proceed with any sale until this matter is resolved through proper legal channels." Sandra's mask finally slipped completely. "You vindictive old woman," she snarled, all pretense of civility gone. "We should have put you in a home months ago. You're nothing but a burden, hanging onto a house that's too big for you, too expensive for you to maintain. Michael deserves this inheritance, not you." I felt something shift inside me, a strength I hadn't felt since Harold died. "What I deserve, Sandra, is to live my final years in the home I built with my husband, surrounded by his memory and his love. What you deserve is to face the consequences of trying to steal from a grieving widow." Michael looked up at me then, and for a moment I saw my little boy again, the one who used to apologize profusely when he accidentally hurt someone's feelings. "Mom, I didn't know. I swear I didn't know she changed the will." I studied my son's face, searching for the truth in his eyes. Part of me wanted to believe him, wanted to think that Sandra had manipulated him just as she'd tried to manipulate me. But I'd seen him actively participate in decisions about my future, heard him discuss my deteriorating condition with Sandra when they thought I couldn't hear. "We'll see, Michael," I said softly. "The investigation will reveal exactly who knew what and when." The notary gathered his things, shaking his head. "I'll need to report this to the authorities immediately. Mrs. Patterson, I recommend you contact an attorney specializing in probate fraud. This situation is far beyond a simple document review." As he prepared to leave, Sandra made one last desperate attempt. "Wait," she called after him. "Even if that will is real, Carol's not competent to handle an estate this size. She's 70 years old, living alone, clearly not thinking straight. Someone needs to manage her affairs." I walked slowly to my purse and pulled out a business card, handing it to the notary with a smile. "This is my attorney's contact information. I retained him the day I found Harold's real will. He's been helping me prepare for this moment for weeks." The notary took the card, nodding approvingly. "Very wise, Mrs. Patterson. I can see you've thought this through carefully." After the notary left, Sandra and Michael remained in my living room, the weight of their attempted deception hanging heavy in the air. The afternoon light filtering through the windows cast long shadows across the room, making everything look different, charged with possibility and danger. "What happens now?" Michael asked quietly. I looked at my son, this man I'd raised with love and sacrifice, who'd allowed his wife to convince him to steal from his own mother. The disappointment was almost overwhelming, but underneath it was a growing sense of power, of control returning to my life after months of feeling like a victim. "Now," I said, "we find out exactly how far you were both willing to go to take everything your father and I worked for, and then we face the consequences." As Sandra and Michael exchanged panicked glances, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Harold's death. Hope. Not just hope for keeping my home, but hope that I could reclaim my life, my dignity, and my right to make my own choices about my own future. The battle for my inheritance was just beginning, but for the first time in months, I felt like I had weapons to fight with. The silence stretched between us like a chasm after the notary left. Sandra paced by the window, her heels clicking against the hardwood floors Harold had refinished himself just 2 years before his diagnosis. Michael remained slumped in his father's chair, staring at his hands as if they held answers to questions he was afraid to ask. I settled into my own chair, the one Harold had always called Carol's throne, and studied the 2 people who had tried to steal my life out from under me. The manila folder lay open on the coffee table between us, its contents no longer a secret weapon, but evidence of betrayal that cut deeper than I'd imagined possible. "How did you find it?" Michael asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Dad's real will." I smoothed my skirt, buying myself time to decide how much of the truth to share. The past month had been a journey of discovery that had changed everything I thought I knew about my final years with Harold, about my son's character, and about my own strength. "It started with the roses," I said, looking toward the garden where Harold's prized bushes were beginning their spring bloom. "You remember how particular your father was about his garden journal? He recorded everything. When he planted, when he fertilized, when he pruned." Sandra stopped pacing, her attention caught despite herself. Michael nodded slowly. "After he died, I went through his things in the workshop, trying to decide what to keep, what to donate. I found his garden journal from last year, and there was an entry from November that didn't make sense. I reached for the folder and pulled out a photocopied page. November 15th. He wrote, "Carol's roses need protection from winter pests. Document secured in rose fertilizer container. Spring care instructions inside." Michael leaned forward. "Spring care instructions?" I thought he meant gardening advice. So 3 weeks ago, when I started preparing the garden for spring, I opened that old fertilizer container in the potting shed. I paused, remembering the moment when everything changed. Inside was a sealed plastic bag with the real will, along with a letter addressed to me. Sandra had gone very still. What did the letter say? I pulled out Harold's letter, written in his careful handwriting, each word a testament to his love and his growing suspicion. "Would you like me to read it?" Neither of them answered, but I began reading anyway. "My dearest Carol, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you found this hiding place just as I hoped you would. I've been watching Sandra's behavior these past few months, and I'm deeply concerned about her interest in our financial affairs. She's been asking questions about life insurance policies, about the house value, about what provisions I've made for your care. When I told her you and I had discussed you staying in our home for as long as you're able, she became very insistent that wasn't practical or safe." Michael's face had gone pale. Sandra was staring at me with undisguised hatred. I continued reading. "Last week, I caught her going through my desk when she thought we were both napping. When I confronted her, she claimed she was looking for stamps. Carol, my love, I don't want to create family conflict, but I need to protect you. I've written a new will that ensures you'll have security and independence after I'm gone. I'm hiding it here because I'm beginning to suspect that Sandra might try to interfere with my final wishes." The letter trembled slightly in my hands as I read Harold's final paragraph. "I pray I'm wrong about Sandra's intentions, but if I'm not, please know that everything we built together belongs to you. Don't let anyone convince you that you can't manage on your own. You're stronger than you know, and you deserve to live your remaining years exactly as you choose." When I finished reading, the only sound was the grandfather clock, marking another minute in our changed lives. Michael was crying silently, tears streaming down his face. Sandra stood frozen by the window, her reflection ghost-like in the glass. "He knew," Michael whispered. "Dad knew what you were planning." Sandra whirled around, her composure finally cracking completely. "He was paranoid and sick," she snapped. "Harold was dying, confused, not thinking clearly. He had no right to leave everything to her when he knew she couldn't handle it." "Couldn't handle what?" I asked, genuinely curious about her reasoning. "Couldn't handle living in my own home? Couldn't handle managing finances I've been managing since before you were born?" "You're 70 years old," Sandra said, as if my age was a crime. "This house is too big, too expensive. The property taxes alone are more than most people's rent. You don't drive at night anymore. You've had 2 falls in the past year. And last month I found expired food in your refrigerator. I almost laughed at the absurdity of her concerns. Sandra, I'm 70, not 90. I don't drive at night because I choose not to, not because I can't. I've had 2 falls because I was rushing to answer the phone when you called, worried about some imaginary crisis, and that expired yogurt was 2 days past its date, hardly a sign of dementia. Michael wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. Mom, we were just worried about you. After Dad died, you seemed so lost, so fragile. I was grieving, I said firmly. Grief isn't incompetence, and being sad doesn't mean I need you and Sandra making decisions about my life without consulting me. I stood up and walked to Harold's desk, pulling out a stack of documents I'd organized over the past weeks. Since we're being honest now, let me show you exactly how competent I am. I spread the papers across the coffee table. Bank statements, investment portfolios, insurance policies, utility bills, medical records. These are my financial records for the past 6 months. My accounts are balanced to the penny. My bills are paid on time. My investments are performing well. My medical checkup last month showed I'm in excellent health for my age. Sandra glanced at the documents, then looked away. Anyone can fake paperwork. These aren't fake, I said calmly. Call my bank, call my doctor, call my investment advisor. Better yet, call the attorney who's been helping me investigate the fraudulent will you filed. Michael looked up sharply. What attorney? James Morrison, from Morrison, Bradley and Associates. I retained him the day I found Harold's real will. He's been helping me gather evidence about how the fake will came to be filed. I pulled out another document. This is a timeline we've constructed, showing exactly when and how Harold's will was altered. I handed Michael the timeline, watching his face as he read. The fake will had been filed just 5 days after Harold's death, while I was still deep in grief and planning the funeral. The witnesses listed had been contacted by my attorney and confirmed they'd never signed any document for Harold. The handwriting analysis showed clear signs of forgery. Sandra, Michael said, his voice barely audible, please tell me you didn't do this. Sandra's silence was answer enough. The question now, I continued, is whether you were an active participant or an unwitting victim of your wife's scheme. Michael looked between Sandra and me, confusion and dawning horror warring in his expression. I signed some papers, he admitted slowly. Sandra said they were standard probate documents, that we needed to file them quickly to avoid complications. What papers, specifically? I asked. He ran his hands through his hair. Witness statements, I think. Sandra said you were too distraught to handle the legal details, that she'd take care of everything. I felt a mixture of relief and disappointment. Relief that my son hadn't been the mastermind of the deception. Disappointment that he'd been so easily manipulated into participating in it. Michael, you signed witness statements claiming you were present when Harold signed a will that was never actually signed in your presence. That's perjury. The color drained from his face. I didn't know. Sandra said it was just a formality, that Dad had already explained his wishes to both of us. Sandra finally spoke, her voice cold and defensive. Harold was dying. He could barely hold a pen toward the end. Someone had to make sure his wishes were documented properly. His wishes were documented properly, I said, tapping Harold's real will. In his own handwriting, witnessed by neighbors who had no financial interest in the outcome. What you documented was your own greed. I sat back down, feeling suddenly exhausted by the weight of these revelations. For months, I'd been made to feel like a burden, a problem to be solved. Now I understood it had all been manipulation, designed to make me doubt my own competence, while Sandra positioned herself to benefit from Harold's death. What happens now? Michael asked again. Now we wait for the legal process to run its course, I said. My attorney has already filed a motion to invalidate the fraudulent will and probate Harold's real will. The district attorney's office is reviewing the evidence for potential criminal charges. Sandra's face went white. Criminal charges? Document fraud, perjury, attempted theft by deception. The prosecutor will decide which charges to file, but Mr. Morrison thinks the case is very strong. Michael stood up abruptly. Mom, I'll testify. I'll tell them everything Sandra told me to sign, everything she said about the documents. I didn't know it was fraud, I swear. I looked at my son, this man who'd allowed his wife to convince him to participate in stealing from his own mother, and felt a complex mixture of love, disappointment, and cautious hope. I appreciate that, Michael, but you need to understand that your cooperation now doesn't erase what you allowed to happen. I know, he whispered. I know, and I'm sorry. Sandra was backing toward the door, her face a mask of rage and panic. This isn't over, she said. I'll fight this. I'll prove Harold wasn't competent when he wrote that will. Good luck with that, I replied calmly. Harold's doctor has already provided a written statement confirming that he was mentally sharp right up until his final week. The neighbor who helped him set up his new computer 3 days before he died will testify to his mental clarity. And Harold's own letter explains exactly why he felt the need to hide his real will from you. Sandra slammed out of the house, leaving Michael and me alone with the wreckage of our family and the truth that had finally come to light. As the afternoon sun slanted through the windows, illuminating the documents that would determine my future, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Harold died. Not just hope, but power. The power that comes from knowing you've been underestimated by people who thought grief made you weak, when it had actually made you more determined to protect what mattered most. The battle wasn't over, but for the first time, I knew I was going to win. Michael stayed after Sandra left, sitting in his father's chair like a lost child seeking comfort in familiar surroundings. I made tea, the same way I'd done countless times when he was young and troubled, though this was a kind of trouble I'd never imagined we'd face together. Mom, he said as I handed him the steaming cup, I need to tell you everything. About the papers Sandra had me sign, about the things she said, about what we plan to do with the house. I settled into my chair, preparing myself for revelations I suspected would be painful but necessary. The afternoon light was fading, casting long shadows across the living room where Harold and I had raised our son, never imagining he might one day become complicit in stealing our life's work. Start from the beginning, I said gently. When did Sandra first mention changing your father's will? Michael stared into his teacup, his hands wrapped around it like it was an anchor. It wasn't like that at first. It started while Dad was still sick, maybe 6 months before he died. Sandra would visit during the day when you were at your book club or doing errands. I remembered those visits. Sandra had suddenly become so attentive, bringing soup, offering to help with Harold's medications, insisting I take breaks from caregiving. At the time, I'd been grateful for her support. She'd sit with Dad and talk about family finances, Michael continued. She said she was worried about how you'd manage after he died, about whether you'd be able to maintain this big house, handle the property taxes, deal with repairs. And what did your father say? That's just it. He didn't really engage with her questions. He'd just nod politely and change the subject. Sandra said it proved he wasn't thinking clearly about practical matters, that someone needed to step in and make hard decisions. I felt a chill remembering Harold's letter, his growing suspicion about Sandra's interest in our finances. He'd been more aware than any of us realized. When did she first suggest changing the will? Michael set down his cup, his hands shaking slightly. About a month before Dad died, she came to our house one evening and said she'd been researching elder care options, that this house would be too much for you to handle alone. She had brochures for assisted living facilities, information about selling the house. You discussed selling my home while I was caring for your dying father? The pain in my voice made him flinch. Sandra said we were planning for your future, that it would be cruel to leave you struggling with a house you couldn't manage. She showed me articles about elderly people getting hurt in homes that were too big for them, about widows who became isolated and depressed. I thought about all the times Sandra had expressed concern about my safety and well-being, how she'd subtly questioned my ability to manage my own life. Now I understood it had been a calculated campaign to convince my son that I was incompetent. She convinced you I needed to be managed. She made it seem like love, Michael admitted, tears starting again. Like we were protecting you from yourself. She said Dad wasn't thinking clearly about what would be best for you, that grief and illness had made him hold on to an unrealistic vision of you staying here alone. I stood up and walked to the mantel where our family photos were displayed. Pictures of Michael's childhood, his wedding to Sandra, Harold, and me at various stages of our marriage. In several of the more recent photos, Sandra stood slightly apart from the rest of us, her smile not quite matching her eyes. "Tell me about the will," I said. Michael's voice dropped to almost a whisper. Sandra said she'd found a copy of Dad's will in his desk, but that it didn't make sense. According to her, it left everything to you but didn't include any provisions for your care if you became unable to manage on your own. So she decided to create her own version? She called it clarifying Dad's intentions. She said we needed to file a will that included guardianship provisions, that left the house to me so I could make decisions about your care when you needed them. The calculated cruelty of it took my breath away. Sandra had used Michael's love for me as a weapon against both of us, convincing him that stealing my independence was an act of protection. What about the signatures, Michael? You saw your father's handwriting every day. Didn't you notice the forgery? He covered his face with his hands. Sandra said Dad had dictated the will to her because his handwriting had gotten so bad from the medication. She showed me papers where he'd supposedly signed, but his hand was shaky. I thought it was because he was so sick. I pulled Harold's real will from the folder and showed it to Michael. This is your father's actual handwriting from 3 months before he died. Compare it to what Sandra filed. Michael studied both documents, his face growing pale as the differences became obvious. Harold's real signature was clear and strong, written by a man who knew exactly what he was doing. The forged signature was shaky and uncertain, designed to look like the handwriting of someone whose faculties were failing. "She practiced," Michael said, his voice filled with horror. "I remember finding papers in her purse with Dad's signature written over and over. She said she was helping him with some insurance forms because his arthritis was acting up. She was learning to forge his handwriting." The phone rang, startling us both. I glanced at the caller ID and saw it was my attorney. "James," I answered. "What news do you have?" "Carol, we need to meet tomorrow morning. The handwriting analysis came back, and there's something else you need to know about Sandra's background." "What kind of something else?" "The kind that suggests this isn't her first time manipulating a family's inheritance. Can you come in at 10? After I hung up, Michael was staring at me with a mixture of fear and curiosity. "What was that about?" "It seems your wife may have done this before." The next morning, James Morrison's office felt like a war room. Documents covered every available surface, and 2 additional chairs had been brought in for what I suspected would be a lengthy briefing. Michael had asked to come with me, and despite my lingering hurt over his role in Sandra's scheme, I'd agreed. Whatever we were about to learn, he needed to hear it. James, a distinguished man in his 60s who'd handled Harold's business legal matters for years, greeted us with a somber expression. "Carol, Michael, please sit down. What I have to share with you is going to be difficult to hear." He opened a thick file folder. "The handwriting analysis confirms what we suspected. The signatures on the fraudulent will are forgeries and skillful ones. This wasn't someone's first attempt at document fraud." I felt vindicated but not surprised. "You said Sandra might have done this before?" "I hired a private investigator to look into Sandra's background. What we found is troubling." James pulled out several documents. "Sandra Martinez isn't her real name. She was born Sandra Kellerman in Ohio. She's been married 3 times before her marriage to Michael." Michael went rigid beside me. 3 times? She told me I was her second husband, that her first marriage ended because of her ex-husband's drinking problem. Her first marriage was to Robert Chen in 2008. Robert was 68 years old, a widower with substantial assets. He died 18 months after their marriage, leaving everything to Sandra. The death was ruled natural causes, but Robert's children contested the will, claiming Sandra had isolated their father from his family and influenced him to change his estate planning. I felt cold suddenly. What happened with the contest? It was settled out of court. Sandra received a significant portion of the estate, and the family received the rest. But here's what's interesting. Robert's original will had left everything to his children. The will that was probated had been rewritten just weeks before his death. Michael was breathing hard now. And the other marriages? Husband number 2 was Frank Martinez, which is where Sandra got the last name she uses now. Frank was 72, also a widower with adult children. He died of a heart attack 2 years after their marriage. Again, there was a will that left everything to Sandra, replacing an earlier will that had benefited his children. "Let me guess," I said. "The children contested that will too." They did, and they lost. Frank's doctor testified that he was competent when he signed the new will. Sandra inherited his house, his savings, everything. The children were left with nothing. James pulled out another document. Husband number 3 was David Patterson. This case is more recent and more relevant to your situation. David was 65 when he married Sandra, not elderly, but a widower with a successful business and substantial assets. What happened to David? Michael asked, though I could tell he was afraid of the answer. David is still alive, but he's lost everything. 6 months after their marriage, David suffered a minor stroke. Nothing life-threatening, but it affected his memory and concentration temporarily. While he was recovering, Sandra convinced him to sign papers giving her power of attorney over his finances. I could see where this was going. She cleaned out his accounts. Worse than that, she sold his business, his house, moved his investments to accounts she controlled. When David recovered enough to understand what had happened, Sandra filed for divorce and claimed half of everything as community property. Since she'd moved and sold his assets during their marriage, the court treated them as marital property. Michael was staring at James in horror. Where is David now? Living in a 1-bedroom apartment, working part-time at 70 years old to pay for basic necessities. His children have cut off contact because they blame him for falling for Sandra's manipulation. The room fell silent as we absorbed this information. Sandra hadn't just tried to steal my inheritance. She was a professional predator who targeted vulnerable older adults, using marriage as a weapon to gain access to their assets. There's more, James continued. After David's divorce was finalized, Sandra moved here and within 6 months had met and married Michael. The timeline suggests she specifically chose this area and specifically targeted your family. How could she target us specifically? I asked. Your husband owned a successful engineering firm. Your financial information was part of public business records. Sandra could have researched potential targets, looking for older men with substantial assets and family structures that might be vulnerable to manipulation. Michael stood up abruptly, pacing to the window. She played me. Everything about our meeting, our courtship, our marriage, it was all calculated. I'm sorry, Michael, James said gently. But yes, it appears Sandra targeted your family specifically. The question now is what we do with this information. I thought about Harold's letter, his growing suspicion about Sandra's motives. My husband had been smarter than any of us realized. He'd seen through Sandra's act and taken steps to protect me, even knowing it might create family conflict. We use it to make sure she never does this to another family, I said firmly. And we make sure Michael understands exactly how close he came to helping her destroy his own mother. As we prepared to leave James's office, armed with evidence that would not only protect my inheritance but potentially put Sandra in prison, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Harold's death, the power that comes from being underestimated by someone who thought grief made you weak. Sandra had picked the wrong widow to prey upon, and she was about to learn just how much fight this 70-year-old woman had left in her. The drive home from James's office was silent. Both Michael and I lost in our own thoughts about the woman who had infiltrated our family with such calculated precision. When we pulled into my driveway, Sandra's car was already there, parked at an aggressive angle that blocked part of my walkway. She was sitting on my front porch steps like she owned the place, which, I supposed, she'd believed she did. She's been calling me all morning, Michael said quietly, his hand still gripping the steering wheel. 15 missed calls, dozens of text messages. She knows something's wrong. I gathered the folder of documents from James's office, feeling their weight both literally and figuratively. Inside were the tools to destroy Sandra's carefully constructed lies, but also the evidence that would likely send my son's wife to prison. However I felt about Sandra, this would devastate Michael. Are you ready for this? I asked him. He took a shaky breath. I don't think I have a choice. Sandra stood as we approached, her designer outfit perfectly coordinated despite the circumstances. Even in crisis, she maintained that polished appearance that had initially impressed me when Michael first brought her home. Now I saw it for what it was, a costume designed to inspire trust and respectability. Where have you been? She demanded of Michael, ignoring me completely. I've been trying to reach you for hours. We need to talk about this ridiculous situation with your mother. We need to talk, all right, Michael replied, his voice steadier than I'd expected, but probably not about what you think. I unlocked the front door and led them into the living room where this nightmare had begun just yesterday. The manila folder from James's office joined the original documents on my coffee table, creating a small mountain of evidence that would reshape all our lives. Sandra immediately noticed the new papers. "What's all this?" "Carol, if you're trying to intimidate us with legal documents, you should know that anyone can create official-looking paperwork. The will we filed is legitimate." "Sit down, Sandra," I said calmly, taking my usual chair. "We have quite a lot to discuss." She remained standing, her arms crossed defensively. "I'm not sitting anywhere. Michael, tell your mother to stop this nonsense before she embarrasses herself further. The house is sold, the contracts are signed, and no amount of fake documents is going to change that." I opened James's folder and pulled out the private investigator's report. Sandra Kellerman, born in Akron, Ohio, on March 15, 1986. Married to Robert Chen from 2008 to 2010. Married to Frank Martinez from 2011 to 2013. Married to David Patterson from 2014 to 2016. Married to Michael Patterson in 2017. The color drained from Sandra's face, but she recovered quickly. "I don't know what kind of background check you think you've run, but my name is Sandra Martinez. Not whatever you just said." "Martinez was your third husband's name," Michael said quietly. "Frank Martinez, the 72-year-old widower whose estate you inherited after he died of a convenient heart attack." Sandra spun to face him. "Michael, you can't possibly believe whatever garbage she's fed you. Your mother is obviously having some kind of mental episode, creating conspiracy theories because she can't accept that your father left the house to us." "Us?" I repeated. "Harold left the house to us?" "Sandra, you weren't mentioned in either will, not the real one or the fake one you created. According to your forgery, Harold left everything to Michael, not to you." She faltered for a moment, realizing her mistake. "Obviously, I meant Michael. We're married, so what belongs to him belongs to me." "Actually," I continued, pulling out another document, "what belongs to Michael might be in question soon. You see, we've discovered some interesting things about your previous marriages and what happened to your husband's assets." I began reading from the investigator's report. "Robert Chen, your first husband, changed his will 3 weeks before his death, leaving everything to you instead of his children. The handwriting analysis from that case shows the same characteristics as the forgery in Harold's will." Sandra was backing toward the door now, her composure cracking. "This is harassment. You can't prove anything." "Frank Martinez, your second husband, also changed his will shortly before his death. Again, handwriting experts noted irregularities, but the case was never fully investigated because his children couldn't afford to fight your legal team." Michael was staring at his wife with growing horror. "Sandra, please tell me this isn't true. Please tell me you didn't kill those men." "I didn't kill anyone," she snapped, but there was panic in her voice now. "Robert had a heart condition. Frank had diabetes. These things happen when you marry older men." "And David Patterson?" I asked. "Your third husband, who's still alive but lost everything to you after a convenient stroke that impaired his judgment just long enough for you to gain control of his finances?" Sandra's mask finally slipped completely. "David was an old fool who didn't appreciate what he had. I gave him companionship, took care of him, made him happy. I earned everything I got from that marriage." "By stealing it while he was medically incapacitated?" "By being a devoted wife," she snarled. "Something you wouldn't understand, since you spent 40 years as a doormat to a man who never appreciated your sacrifices." The insult to Harold hit me like a physical blow, but it also crystallized my resolve. This woman had not only tried to steal my inheritance and manipulate my son, but now she was attacking the memory of the man I'd loved for 4 decades. "Harold appreciated me enough to protect me from you," I said, my voice cold as winter. "He saw through your act months before he died. That's why he wrote a new will and hid it where only I would find it." I pulled out Harold's letter and read aloud the passage about Sandra's suspicious behavior, her intrusive questions about our finances, her insistence that I wouldn't be able to manage alone. Each word was like a nail in the coffin of her deception. "He was paranoid and sick," Sandra protested, but her voice lacked conviction now. "He was protective and smart," Michael said, speaking for the first time in several minutes. "Sandra, I've seen the handwriting analysis. I know you forged Dad's signature. I know you lied to me about the witness statements. I know you convinced me to commit perjury." Sandra whirled on him. "You committed perjury because you're weak and stupid, just like your father. Do you have any idea how easy it was to manipulate both of you? Harold with his sentimental attachment to this rotting old house. You with your pathetic need to be the good son protecting his helpless mother." The cruelty in her voice was breathtaking. This was who she really was, stripped of pretense and charm. A predator who viewed human emotions as weaknesses to exploit. "I'm calling the police," I said, reaching for my phone. "Wait," Sandra said quickly, her tone shifting back toward manipulation. "Carol, we can work this out. I know you're upset, but think about what's best for everyone. Michael and I will move out. You can have your house back. We'll all go our separate ways. After you committed document fraud, perjury, and attempted theft, mistakes were made," she said, as if forgery was a minor accounting error, but no real harm was done. "You have your house, your inheritance, everything Harold wanted you to have. Why drag this through the courts and put Michael through a criminal trial?" I looked at my son, who was sitting with his head in his hands, the weight of his wife's betrayal crushing him. Then I thought about Robert Chen's children, Frank Martinez's family, David Patterson living in poverty at 70 because of Sandra's greed. "Because," I said, dialing 911, "you're going to keep doing this until someone stops you. And it might as well be me." As I spoke to the emergency dispatcher, Sandra made a desperate attempt to leave, but Michael blocked her path to the door. "You're not running this time," he said, his voice stronger than I'd heard it in years. "I won't let you destroy another family the way you've destroyed ours." "Our family?" Sandra laughed bitterly. "Michael, you fool. We never had a family. I married you for access to your father's assets. Everything else was just acting." The police arrived within minutes, and I watched Sandra's carefully constructed world collapse around her. The confident, manipulative woman who had tried to steal my life was led away in handcuffs, still protesting her innocence and claiming I was a bitter old woman seeking revenge. After the police left with Sandra and their preliminary statements, Michael and I sat in the quiet of my living room, surrounded by the evidence of his wife's crimes and the wreckage of our family trust. "Mom," he said finally, "how do I even begin to apologize for this?" I looked at my son, this man who had been so thoroughly manipulated that he'd nearly helped steal his own inheritance from his mother. The hurt was deep and would take time to heal, but underneath it was something stronger, relief that Sandra's hold over him was finally broken. "You begin by understanding that you were a victim too," I said. "Sandra is a professional predator. She studied our family, identified our vulnerabilities, and exploited them with surgical precision. The fact that she fooled you doesn't make you evil, Michael. It makes you human." "But I signed those papers. I helped her file the fake will." "Because she convinced you it was an act of love, of protecting me. That's what makes her so dangerous. She weaponizes our best impulses against us." We sat in silence for a while, watching the sun set through the windows of the house that Harold had fought to protect for me. Tomorrow would bring legal proceedings, media attention, and the long process of rebuilding our relationship. But tonight, for the first time since Harold died, I felt truly safe in my own home. Sandra's reign of terror was over. My inheritance was secure. And most importantly, my son was finally free from the woman who had nearly destroyed us both. The battle for my future had been won, but the real work of healing was just beginning. The weeks following Sandra's arrest passed in a blur of legal meetings, police interviews, and phone calls from prosecutors building their case. My quiet retirement had transformed into the center of a criminal investigation that stretched across 3 states, as authorities worked to unravel the full extent of Sandra's predatory schemes. Michael had moved back into his childhood bedroom temporarily, claiming he couldn't bear to be in the house he'd shared with Sandra. I found him there one morning, sitting on the twin bed surrounded by photo albums, trying to understand how thoroughly he'd been deceived. "Look at this," he said, holding up a picture from their wedding day. I thought she looked radiant. Now I see it was just satisfaction. She'd successfully hooked her next victim. I sat beside him on the bed where I'd once read him bedtime stories and helped him with homework. The irony wasn't lost on me that we were having this conversation in the same room where he'd grown from boy to man before Sandra had twisted his judgment and nearly destroyed our family. "Michael, you need to stop torturing yourself with those photos." "How do I do that, Mom?" "How do I accept that my entire marriage was a lie? That every I love you, every intimate moment, every plan we made together was just part of her performance?" Before I could answer, the phone rang. James Morrison's name appeared on the caller ID, and I knew from experience that calls from my attorney during this period usually brought significant news. "Carol," James said, his voice containing a note of satisfaction I rarely heard from him. "I'm calling with an update on Sandra's case. The district attorney wants to meet with you tomorrow. They're ready to present their plea offer." "Plea offer? She's willing to plead guilty?" "More than willing. Desperate might be a better word. The evidence against her is overwhelming, and she's facing charges in 3 states now. Ohio and Florida have both filed extradition requests for the Chen and Martinez cases." Michael was listening intently to my side of the conversation. I put the call on speaker so he could hear the details. "What kind of plea are they offering?" I asked. 15 years in federal prison, full restitution to all victims, and cooperation in recovering assets she may have hidden. She'll also be required to testify against any accomplices they uncover during the investigation. Accomplices? Carol, Sandra didn't operate entirely alone. The prosecutor believes she had help with some of the more sophisticated aspects of the document fraud, possibly assistance from someone with legal or financial expertise. I felt a chill. Are they suggesting Michael was more involved than we thought? "No," James said quickly. "Michael's cooperation and the evidence of his own victimization have cleared him of any knowing participation, but they think Sandra may have had other partners in previous schemes." After ending the call, Michael and I sat in silence, processing this new information. The idea that Sandra's crimes might be even more extensive than we'd known was both disturbing and somehow validating. It confirmed that we'd been dealing with a true professional, not just an opportunistic family member. "I want to be there tomorrow," Michael said, "when they present the plea offer. I need to see her face when she realizes it's over." The next day, we sat in the district attorney's conference room, a sterile space that felt appropriate for the cold dissection of Sandra's crimes. She entered with her attorney, wearing an orange jumpsuit that stripped away the last remnants of her carefully crafted image. Without her designer clothes and professional makeup, she looked smaller, older, more ordinary. District Attorney Rebecca Martinez, no relation to Sandra's stolen surname, laid out the evidence methodically. Bank records showing Sandra's pattern of targeting widowed men with substantial assets. Handwriting analyses proving she'd forged wills in multiple states. Testimony from David Patterson about how she'd manipulated him during his medical recovery. "Mrs. Kellerman," the prosecutor said, using Sandra's real name, "you're facing 43 felony counts across 3 states. The evidence against you includes documentary fraud, elder abuse, perjury, and theft by deception. If convicted on all counts, you're looking at life in prison." Sandra's attorney, a tired-looking public defender, pushed a legal pad across the table. "My client is prepared to accept the 15-year plea agreement in exchange for full cooperation and restitution." "I want to hear it from her," I said, surprising everyone in the room, including myself. "I want Sandra to admit what she did, in her own words." Sandra looked up at me, and for a moment I saw a flash of her old arrogance. "You want your pound of flesh, Carol? Fine. Yes, I forged Harold's signature. Yes, I convinced Michael to sign false witness statements. Yes, I tried to steal your inheritance. And the other victims? Robert Chen, Frank Martinez, David Patterson?" Her jaw tightened. "I gave those men companionship and purpose in their final years. Robert and Frank died happy. David was cared for during his illness. I earned what I received from those relationships." "You murdered them." "I never killed anyone," Sandra snapped, her composure cracking. "Robert had a weak heart. Frank was diabetic. I simply helped them understand where their assets would do the most good." The prosecutor leaned forward. "Mrs. Kellerman, are you admitting to elder abuse and financial exploitation in the Chen and Martinez cases?" Sandra's attorney touched her arm, warning her to be careful, but she was beyond caution now. I'm admitting that I'm smarter than the fools I married. Harold was the only one who suspected me, and he was too sick to do anything about it effectively. He wasn't too sick to protect me, I said quietly. He outsmarted you completely. For the first time since I'd known her, Sandra looked genuinely defeated. The confident predator who had manipulated my family was gone, replaced by a woman facing the consequences of her choices. The plea agreement requires full disclosure of all your criminal activities, the prosecutor continued. That includes naming any accomplices who helped with document preparation, financial transfers, or victim identification. Sandra was quiet for a long moment, weighing her options. Finally, she spoke. There's a paralegal in Ohio named Brian Kellerman, my cousin. He helped prepare some of the legal documents and showed me how to research potential targets through public records. More accomplices, more victims, more lives destroyed by Sandra's greed. I thought about David Patterson, working part-time at 70 to survive, and wondered how many other families had been shattered by this woman's calculated cruelty. And the assets you've hidden? The prosecutor asked. Swiss account, Cayman Islands trust, some cryptocurrency wallets. Sandra rattled off account numbers and passwords with the efficiency of someone who'd been planning for this day. It's about 2.3 million total. Michael gasped beside me. The scope of Sandra's crimes was even greater than we'd imagined. She hadn't just stolen from her victims, she'd been systematically looting their estates and hiding the proceeds offshore. That money will be used for restitution to your victims, the prosecutor said, starting with Mrs. Patterson and Mr. David Patterson. Sandra signed the plea agreement with the same careful attention she'd once applied to forging Harold's will. As the handcuffs went back on her wrists, she looked at me one final time. You think you've won, Carol, but look around you. Your son will never trust anyone again. Your family is destroyed. You'll spend your final years alone in that house, surrounded by memories of everything you've lost. I'd rather be alone with my integrity than surrounded by people who see me as prey, I replied. And Michael will heal. He'll learn to trust again, to love again, because that's who he really is underneath the damage you caused. As Sandra was led away, Michael broke down crying, not for his wife, but for the innocence he'd lost, the trust that had been violated, the years of his life that had been built on lies. 3 months later, we sat in the same courtroom for Sandra's sentencing. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s who'd clearly seen too many cases of elder abuse, addressed Sandra directly. Mrs. Kellerman, you targeted vulnerable people during the most difficult periods of their lives. You weaponized their grief, their loneliness, their need for companionship. You turned love itself into a tool for theft and manipulation. Sandra stood with her head bowed, the orange jumpsuit now familiar, her carefully maintained appearance a thing of the past. I hereby sentence you to 15 years in federal prison, with eligibility for parole after 12 years. You will pay full restitution to all victims, and you are permanently barred from serving as executor, trustee, or beneficiary of any estate or trust. As the bailiff led Sandra away for the final time, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not satisfaction, but relief. The woman who had nearly destroyed my family was finally being held accountable for her crimes. Outside the courthouse, Michael and I stood in the sunshine, breathing free air and contemplating our changed lives. What now, Mom? He asked. I thought about Harold's letter, hidden among his roses, protecting me even after death. I thought about the house we'd built together, the memories we'd created, the life I'd been given back. Now we heal, I said. We rebuild our trust, we honor your father's memory, and we make sure his sacrifice wasn't in vain. The legal battle was over, but the real victory was simpler. I was going home to my own house, on my own terms, with my dignity intact and my future secure. Sandra's reign of terror had ended, and my life could finally begin again. 2 years after Sandra's sentencing, I stood in my garden on a crisp October morning, planting tulip bulbs where Harold's roses had once grown. The roses had been beautiful, but they'd served their purpose as guardians of his final message to me. Now it was time for something new, something that belonged entirely to this chapter of my life. Michael found me there, as he did most Saturday mornings now. Our relationship had slowly healed over the months following Sandra's imprisonment, built on a foundation of honesty that was stronger than what we'd had before. He'd moved into a small apartment across town after Sandra's trial, claiming he needed space to figure out who he was without her influence. "Mom, you know you could hire someone to do the gardening," he said, settling onto the garden bench Harold had built for our 30th anniversary. "I could," I agreed, tamping soil around a particularly promising bulb. But then I'd miss the satisfaction of watching something grow from my own efforts. It had become a theme in my new life, the joy of doing things for myself, making my own decisions, living according to my own preferences without wondering how someone else might judge or manipulate my choices. The simple act of choosing tulips over roses felt like a declaration of independence. "I have news," Michael said, his tone carefully neutral in the way he'd adopted when sharing anything that might affect me. Our family had learned painful lessons about secrets and hidden agendas. I straightened up, brushing soil from my gardening gloves. "Good news or complicated news?" "Both, maybe. David Patterson called yesterday. He wanted to thank you again for the restitution money, but that's not why he called." David Patterson, Sandra's third victim, had become an unexpected ally during the legal proceedings. The restitution from Sandra's hidden assets had allowed him to move out of his tiny apartment and into a comfortable retirement community. More importantly, it had restored his children's respect, once they understood how completely he'd been manipulated. What did he want? He's been in touch with Robert Chen's children and Frank Martinez's family. They're planning some kind of memorial service for the victims of Sandra's schemes, and they want to invite you. I considered this. The idea of meeting other families who'd been touched by Sandra's cruelty was both appealing and daunting. We shared a unique bond. We'd all learned hard lessons about trust and vulnerability in our later years. "It's not a memorial for the dead," Michael continued. "It's a celebration of the survivors. David calls it a reclaiming ceremony, a way to take back the narrative from someone who tried to define us as victims." That phrase resonated with me. For too long after Harold's death, I'd allowed others to define me. First as a helpless widow, then as an obstacle to Sandra's plans, finally as a victim of her schemes. Only in the past 2 years had I begun to see myself clearly again, as a woman with agency, intelligence, and the right to shape her own future. I'd like to meet them, I decided. When and where? Next month in Chicago. David thought neutral territory would be best, somewhere none of us have painful associations. As we discussed the details, my phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but I'd learned to answer unknown calls since Sandra's trial. Several investigative journalists had contacted me about her case, and I'd been selective about sharing our story, wanting to ensure it served a purpose beyond sensationalism. "Mrs. Patterson? This is Detective Lisa Chen from the Alameda County Sheriff's Office in California." I caught Michael's attention. Another law enforcement call, another piece of Sandra's criminal puzzle falling into place. "We've been working with the FBI on your daughter-in-law's case, and we've uncovered evidence of additional victims. I wondered if you might be willing to speak with some families who are just beginning to understand what happened to their loved ones." Over the past 2 years, Sandra's imprisonment had led to the discovery of at least 7 additional victims across 4 states. The pattern was always the same: vulnerable older adults, usually widowed, with substantial assets and family situations that could be exploited. Sandra had been operating her schemes for nearly 15 years before she targeted Harold and me. "Of course," I told Detective Chen. "What can I do to help?" "We have a family in Oakland whose father married a woman matching Sandra's description 5 years ago. He died 18 months later, leaving everything to his new wife, who disappeared immediately after his death. The family is struggling to understand what happened and how to move forward." I thought about my own confusion in those first days after discovering Sandra's fraud, the disorientation of realizing that everything I'd believed about my family situation had been carefully constructed lies. These families needed more than legal justice. They needed to know they weren't alone in their experience. "I'll talk to them," I said. "And Detective Chen? If there's ever a trial, if these families need someone to testify about Sandra's methods and impact, I'm available." After ending the call, Michael and I sat quietly in the garden, surrounded by the evidence of new growth and renewal. The conversation with Detective Chen had reminded us that Sandra's impact extended far beyond our family, that our experience was part of a much larger pattern of predatory behavior targeting older adults. "Do you ever regret fighting back?" Michael asked. "Sometimes I wonder if it would have been easier to just accept what happened and move on." I thought about the alternative, living the rest of my life in some sterile assisted living facility, while Sandra and Michael enjoyed the fruits of Harold's lifetime of work. I thought about David Patterson, working part-time at 70 to survive Sandra's theft. I thought about all the families who'd lost not just money, but their trust in human goodness. "Never," I said firmly. Fighting back was the only choice that let me keep my dignity, and more importantly, it was the only choice that might prevent Sandra from destroying more families. That evening, as I prepared dinner in the kitchen, Harold and I had remodeled for our 35th anniversary. I reflected on how much had changed since that terrible day when Sandra announced she was selling my house. The legal battles were over. Sandra was in prison, and the restitution money had restored financial security to her victims. But the real victory was quieter and more personal. I was cooking dinner because I wanted to, not because someone expected it. I was choosing my own television programs, decorating according to my own taste, making plans that reflected my own interests and capabilities. At 72, I was finally living entirely for myself. Michael joined me for dinner, a weekly tradition we'd established after Sandra's trial. He'd started dating again recently, a kind teacher named Rebecca, who understood his complicated history and didn't push him to move faster than he was comfortable with. "Rebecca wants to meet you," he said as we shared the pot roast I'd made from Harold's mother's recipe. "Not because she needs your approval, but because she's curious about the woman who took down a professional con artist." I laughed. "I didn't take down anything. I just refused to be erased from my own life. Same thing, really." As we cleaned up after dinner, Michael paused at the kitchen window that overlooked the garden where I'd planted the tulips. "Dad would be proud of you, you know, not just for exposing Sandra, but for building this new life, for refusing to be diminished by what happened." I joined him at the window, looking out at the space where Harold's roses had once hidden his final gift to me. "Your father gave me the tools to protect myself, but I had to find the courage to use them. I think that's what he was really trying to teach me, that I was stronger than I knew." Later that night, after Michael had gone home to his apartment and his slowly healing life, I sat in Harold's chair with a cup of tea and the photo albums I'd been avoiding for 2 years. Pictures of our early marriage, Michael's childhood, family vacations, holiday celebrations. A life built on genuine love and shared dreams, so different from the calculated performance Sandra had staged. In one album, I found a letter Harold had written me on our 40th anniversary, just months before his cancer diagnosis. "My dearest Carol," it read, "40 years ago I promised to love, honor, and protect you. I hope I've kept the first 2 promises faithfully. As for protection, I pray you'll never need it from anything more serious than spiders in the basement. But if you ever do, remember that you have everything inside you needed to protect yourself. You're braver than you believe, stronger than you seem, and more beloved than you know." Harold had seen something in me that I'd forgotten in the grief following his death. The strength that had carried me through 40 years of marriage, raised a son, built a home, and a life worth protecting. Sandra had counted on that strength being diminished by loss and age. She'd been catastrophically wrong. As I prepared for bed in the house that was finally, unquestionably mine, I thought about the families I'd soon meet in Chicago, people who were learning the same painful lessons about trust and vulnerability that Michael and I had learned. I thought about the other families Detective Chen was helping, people who were just beginning to understand how thoroughly they'd been deceived. Tomorrow, I would call David Patterson and accept his invitation to the reclaiming ceremony. I would continue working with law enforcement to help other Sandra's victims find justice and healing. I would tend my garden, cook my meals, make my own decisions about my own life. But tonight, I would simply be grateful for the gift Harold had given me. Not just the house and the financial security, but the reminder that I was strong enough to fight for what mattered most. Sandra had tried to steal my future, but she'd only succeeded in helping me discover exactly how much fight this 72-year-old woman had left in her. I turned off the lights and headed upstairs to the bedroom I'd shared with Harold for nearly 4 decades, now reclaimed as my own sanctuary. Outside my windows, the tulip bulbs I'd planted were sleeping in the soil, gathering strength for their spring emergence. Like me, they'd learned to grow in ground that had once nurtured something else, creating beauty from the ashes of what came before. The house settled around me with familiar sounds, the grandfather clock marking another hour, the old furnace clicking on against the October chill, the whisper of wind through the trees Harold and I had planted when Michael was young. These were the sounds of home, of permanence, of a life that belonged entirely to me. Sandra was gone, her schemes exposed, her victims compensated and healing. Michael was rebuilding his life with hard-won wisdom about trust and manipulation. I was exactly where I belonged, in my own home, living my own life, making my own choices about my own future. The battle for my inheritance had been won, but more importantly, the battle for my identity had been won too. I was Carol Patterson, widow of Harold, mother of Michael, survivor of Sandra's schemes, and architect of my own remaining years. And that was more than enough.